The Consciousness Code Podcast, Episode 18, Collective Conscious States, How Groups Shape Perception, Certainty, and Emotional Reality. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code Podcast. In the last episode, we explored linguistic resonance and the human field. We looked at how speech does not move through empty channels, but through bodies, nervous systems, timing, tone, and relational atmosphere. We explored why some language lands more deeply than logic alone can explain, why speech can regulate or destabilize, why verbal climates become internal speech, and why words carry more than content. We ended by widening the frame, because if language can synchronize or fracture people one-to-one, then the same is true at scale. Once repeated language enters groups, it becomes social atmosphere. Once a verbal rhythm becomes collective, it begins to shape more than conversation. It begins to shape shared certainty, shared fear, shared righteousness, and shared emotional reality. And that is where we move now. This episode is about collective conscious states, about the fact that human beings do not only think and feel as individuals. They also participate in emotional and perceptual fields larger than themselves. Fields that can intensify certainty, shape what feels obvious, amplify fear, organize belonging, and alter what becomes thinkable in the first place. Because one of the most unsettling truths about consciousness is that a person who seems reasonable alone can become extreme in a crowd. A group can become tense, euphoric, suspicious, or morally certain far more quickly than any one individual inside it might have predicted. People say and do things in groups they might never do in solitude. Online swarms can create a level of certainty that feels larger than any single mind. A workplace can begin thinking through urgency. A movement can begin thinking through outrage. A spiritual community can begin thinking through purity. A nation can begin thinking through fear. The field grows larger than the individual, and yet individuals still experience it as though the certainty were their own. That is why this episode matters. Not to encourage cynicism toward all groups, all communities, or all forms of belonging. We need belonging. We need shared meaning. We need solidarity. We need collective life. The problem is not that people gather. The problem is that collective states can become so emotionally convincing that we start replacing reflection. We can make something feel true through force of atmosphere, repetition, and social reinforcement long before it has been examined with enough clarity. So the work here is not withdrawal from collective life. It is discernment within it, literacy inside crowd energy, the ability to notice when a group is widening your humanity, and when it is narrowing it into performance, certainty, or fusion. So today we begin there, with the recognition that consciousness scales, that it does not stop at the level of the individual mind. That groups can generate emotional and perceptual climates powerful enough to shape what feels urgent, obvious, moral, and real. And once you see that clearly, you start asking different questions. Not only what do I think, but what is this field asking me to become? Not only what do I believe, but what is being rewarded in this atmosphere? Not only why does this feel so certain, but what is the group doing to make certainty feel necessary? That is the territory we enter now, into the psychology of the crowd, into the atmosphere of the group, into the deeper question of how to remain conscious inside the field. Part 1. Groups can think and feel in ways individuals alone might not. Most people have seen this happen, even if they have not stopped to study it properly. Someone who seems relatively measured alone becomes sharper, louder, more polarized, or more extreme in a group. A room shifts quickly from uncertainty to certainty, from discomfort to outrage, from hesitation to moral clarity. A crowd begins carrying a feeling that is larger than any one person inside it. It becomes easier to chant, condemn, defend, idealize, panic, scapegoat, or conform when the state is collective than when the same person is sitting quietly by themselves. The shift can be dramatic, but often it is subtle enough that nobody names it. The group simply becomes the mind. This is one of the first things that needs to be faced honestly. Groups can think and feel in ways individuals alone might not. Not because people become non-human in crowds, but because the field changes what becomes available. Emotion amplifies, attention synchronizes, belonging pressures interpretation. Repeated language begins carrying more force. The individual mind is no longer orienting only from its own internal processes. It is orienting inside a shared atmosphere, and shared atmospheres can become very powerful very quickly. You can feel this in ordinary rooms long before you get to large crowds or major social movements. A meeting can turn tense in under a minute. A family gathering can become emotionally loaded before anyone has said anything explicit. A friendship group can become performative, mocking, or conspiratorial through a few exchanges of tone and timing alone. A classroom can tip into collective anxiety when one dominant emotional tone takes hold. The group state begins carrying people. It gives them permission to feel more intensely, speak more confidently, suppress more doubt, or adopt a stronger posture than they would alone. And this is why the old assumption that consciousness is purely private begins to break down. Because the field itself becomes part of what consciousness is doing, it begins shaping what feels obvious, urgent, and true. Think about someone alone reading an article, watching an event, or hearing a controversial claim. Alone, they may have mixed feelings. They may notice complexity. They may not yet know what they think. There is still room for internal movement. Now place that same person in a highly charged group where everyone around them is already aligned emotionally. The atmosphere may be suspicious, triumphant, outraged, wounded, morally certain, or euphoric. The person's own ambiguity now meets a field that is offering relief from ambiguity. The emotional tone of the group starts becoming a guide. Certain interpretations become easier to inhabit. Other possibilities start feeling costly, disloyal, weak, or naive. The person may still think they are simply seeing clearly, but what has happened is that the field has helped organize their clarity in advance. This is one reason crowd consciousness should never be reduced to many individuals side by side. A crowd is not just a collection, it becomes a field. It develops momentum, tone, threshold, expectation, and emotional permission. It teaches the people inside it what kind of self is available there. In one crowd, fear is available. In another, righteousness. In another, ecstatic certainty. In another, aggressive belonging. In another, moral urgency. The crowd does not merely contain these emotions, it amplifies and circulates them. You can see this clearly in events people later struggle to explain. Someone says, "I don't know why I joined in," or "It all happened so quickly," or "At the time it just felt obvious." Those statements are not always evasions. Sometimes they are rough descriptions of the fact that the collective field became more psychologically powerful than private hesitation. Once the atmosphere gained enough force, the person's individual caution no longer carried equal weight. This is not only true of dramatic crowds or public spectacles. It happens in smaller and more respectable environments all the time. A workplace team can become collectively cynical. A department can become collectively anxious. A religious community can become collectively certain. A fan community can become collectively defensive. A social circle can become collectively suspicious. A political group can become collectively righteous. An online space can become collectively inflamed. In each case, what matters is not simply the ideas present, but the emotional climate in which those ideas are repeated, reinforced, and embodied. That emotional climate shapes what feels sayable. It shapes what can be questioned. It shapes what becomes rewarded. It shapes who is admired and who becomes suspect. Over time, these climates start affecting the very structure of perception. People begin noticing through the atmosphere they inhabit. A group organized around grievance becomes highly sensitive to insult and injustice, sometimes accurately, sometimes compulsively. A group organized around fear becomes highly sensitive to threat and infiltration. A group organized around moral superiority becomes highly sensitive to impurity and deviation. The field becomes a way of seeing. Because these collective states are often emotionally intense, they can feel truer than they are. Not because they are always false, but because emotional force is easily mistaken for epistemic certainty. A room that feels charged can interpret feel more obvious. A shared emotional reaction can make dissent feel almost absurd. The person thinks, how could anyone not see this, without noticing that what they are partly experiencing is not only reality, but synchronized atmosphere. This is why crowds can be so seductive. They reduce ambiguity. They enlarge feeling. They make the self feel part of something bigger, clearer, more certain, more morally alive. And that can be deeply regulating in the short term, especially for people who feel fragmented, alone, underdefined, or uncertain in private life. The group says, in effect, here is what matters, here is how to feel, here is who we are, here is what is obvious, here is what side you are on. That kind of clarity can be intoxicating, but it can also be dangerous because once the field becomes strong enough, reflection often loses ground. The person may no longer be asking, what is true, in any wide sense. They may be asking, what is this field making impossible to doubt? Those are not the same question. So the opening insight of this episode is this. Groups generate emotional and perceptual climates. Collective states shape what feels obvious, urgent, and true. Crowd consciousness is not merely many individuals side by side. It becomes a field. And once you begin seeing that clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. How do collective states actually form? How does a group move from separate people into a shared emotional climate? How do emotion, language, belonging, repetition, and attention begin synchronizing around the same interpretive field until the atmosphere starts carrying thought? That is where we move next. Part 2. How collective states form, if groups can think and feel in ways individuals alone might not. Then the next question is how that actually happens. Not in mystical terms. Not as though a crowd becomes some supernatural force, but in grounded psychological and relational terms. Because collective states do not appear from nowhere. They form through processes that are familiar once you slow them down enough to see them. Emotional contagion at scale, shared language, repeated framing, mirroring within groups, social reward and punishment cues, and emotional baselines that emerge through repetition. Start with emotional contagion at scale. In one-to-one situations, emotional contagion already shapes people more than they usually realize. One person's tension tightens another's body. One person's excitement lifts the room. One person's fear becomes everyone's vigilance. In groups, this process intensifies because the emotion is no longer being mirrored through one relational exchange, but through many at once. The field begins feeding itself. If enough people in a room become anxious, righteous, suspicious, ecstatic, or angry, those states begin to look less like private reactions and more like reality itself. The emotion no longer feels like something passing through individuals. It becomes the atmosphere. This is why collective fear can escalate so quickly. One person reacts. Others respond to the reaction. The body language of the group shifts. Tone changes. The pace of speech changes. Suddenly, people are not only reacting to the original event, but to one another's responses to the event. Emotional reinforcement compounds. What might have remained ambiguous in solitude becomes increasingly obvious inside a charged field. Language then stabilizes the state. Collective emotional energy on its own can remain diffuse for a while, but once shared language and repeated framing enter, the feeling begins acquiring structure. The group starts naming what is happening in similar ways. The same phrases repeat. The same interpretations become legible. The same slogans, labels, enemies, values, or moral cues begin organizing perception. This matters because repeated language does more than describe a collective state. It helps create one. Once enough people are using the same emotionally loaded framing, the field becomes easier to enter and harder to challenge. This is true in something as ordinary as workplace culture. A workplace may begin using the same language around urgency, excellence, loyalty, disruption, ownership, professionalism, or values. On paper, those words may sound neutral or positive, but if they are repeated inside a field of pressure, insecurity, or chronic performance, they begin carrying emotional instruction. People start learning what tone belongs there, what kind of pace is rewarded, what feelings are acceptable, what concerns may be voiced, and what kinds of doubt are costly. The collective state is not only in the official messaging, it is in the emotional use of the repeated language. Mirroring within groups deepens all of this. People do not simply hear collective states. They look around and read them off one another. They notice who is confident, who is hesitating, who is applauding, who is silent, who is tense, who is rewarded, who is ignored, who is emotionally aligned, who is falling out of step. The more synchronized the group becomes, the easier it is for individuals to adjust themselves to its baseline. This mirroring does not require explicit coercion. Often it happens through subtle social cueing. The person sees which emotions are socially legible in that space and begins inhabiting them more fully. That is why social cues matter so much. Groups are constantly communicating what is rewarded or punished, sometimes overtly, but often through much smaller signals. Who gets approval? Who gets warmth? Who gets laughed with? Who gets frozen out? What tone receives admiration? What kind of doubt receives discomfort? What statements produce applause? What kinds of nuance produce silence or suspicion? These cues teach people how to belong. They shape not only what is said, but what becomes thinkable. Over time, the group starts carrying a shared emotional baseline because everybody is being trained, subtly or directly, towards similar states. Family systems show this very clearly. A family may have an emotional baseline of tension, irony, share, urgency, or emotional suppression. That baseline becomes self-reinforcing because people adapt to it and then help reproduce it. One person always keeps things light, another always escalates, another goes quiet, another smooths everything over. The repeated roles stabilize the field, and the field in turn stabilizes the roles. It begins feeling natural, even though it is structured. The same is true in religious communities where reverence, purity, guilt, belonging, or moral certainty may become baseline states carried through repeated language, repeated rituals, and repeated social cueing. Political rallies offer a more obvious version. There, the synchronization is intensified by scale, repetition, symbolic language, shared emotion, and leader-driven amplification. The group receives not only speeches, but a field of coordinated attention and shared emotional rhythm. Applause teaches what belongs. Chants teach what matters. Enemy images teach what threatens. Repetition reduces ambiguity. The crowd begins feeling like one interpretive body. Digital communities do the same thing without physical proximity. An online platform can create collective states through repetition, visibility, algorithmic reinforcement, and emotional contagion. Certain framings appear again and again. Certain tones become normal. Certain reactions are rewarded with likes, shares, status, or belonging. Certain doubts become expensive. Fan cultures can become intensely protective. Protest movements can become morally electrified. Communities can form around shared injury, shared outrage, shared devotion, or shared certainty. The emotional baseline stabilizes through repetition until people entering the space quickly learn how to feel there. And that is the key point of this whole section. Collective states form when emotion, language, belonging, and attention begin synchronizing around the same interpretive field. Once that synchronization takes hold, the group starts carrying people along with it. The field begins shaping what feels true, what feels urgent, what feels dangerous, what feels admirable, and what feels almost impossible to question. And once that happens, the next issue becomes even more important. Why does belonging change perception so deeply? Why do people begin seeing reality differently when inclusion is at stake? That is where we move next. Part 3. Why belonging changes perception if collective states form when emotion, language, attention, and social signaling begin synchronizing around the same field. Then the next question is why those fields become so powerful so quickly. Why does a group atmosphere often feel more convincing than private hesitation? Why do people begin reading reality differently when they are inside a collective environment than when they are alone? Why can an individual who is capable of nuance in private become far more certain, reactive, or performative in a group? Because belonging changes perception. It does not do so in some shallow social way, as though people merely want approval in order to feel liked. Belonging is much deeper than that. It is nervous system relevant. Human beings are social organisms. They regulate through connection, orient through recognition, and often build their sense of reality inside shared fields of meaning. To belong is not only to be socially included, it is to be held inside a pattern of recognition that says, in effect, you are intelligible here, safe enough here, located here, one of us here. When that belonging feels stable, people often have more room for complexity. But when belonging feels contingent, threatened, or tied to a certain form of conformity, perception begins shifting around the need to remain included. This is one reason dissent feels so psychologically expensive. People like to imagine that belief is formed by evidence first and social consequence second. Sometimes that is true, but often the process is more entangled. A person does not only ask, consciously or unconsciously, is this true? They also ask, what happens to me if I see this differently? What happens to me if I say this aloud? What happens to my place in this field if I resist the emotional direction everyone else is moving in? Those questions are. This is why exclusion can feel like threat, even when nothing physically dangerous is occurring. To be outside the group, outside the family story, outside the team rhythm, outside the moral atmosphere, outside the shared certainty, these are not experienced by the organism as small symbolic inconveniences. At a deep level, exclusion can activate something far older and more visceral. Human beings evolved inside dependency, attachment, alliance, and shared protection. To fall out of the group was rarely neutral. It carried real consequence. Even though modern life is more complicated than that, the nervous system still responds to social disconnection with extraordinary seriousness. This is why people will often protect group coherence before truth. Not because they are stupid, not because they secretly love falsehood, but because the body reads disconnection as danger, and coherence can feel like safety. That does not mean coherence is always false. It means the route by which coherence forms matters. In healthy groups, coherence can widen people. It can provide stability, trust, mutual recognition, and enough safety that disagreement does not immediately threaten attachment. In unhealthy groups, coherence becomes rigid. It functions less like shared reality and more like enforced atmosphere. The person begins seeing through the emotional norms of the group because the emotional norms determine what counts as reasonable, moral, safe, intelligent, loyal, or acceptable. Once that happens, perception is no longer only about the world. It is about staying inside the field. You can see this very clearly in families. Every family has emotional norms, whether they are named or not. In one family, anger may be allowed but sadness mocked. In another, practical competence may be rewarded while vulnerability is treated as burden. In another, humor may be the only acceptable route for emotional truth. In another, loyalty may require silence around what everyone clearly sees. Children growing up inside such systems do not merely learn social manners. They learn what kind of perception preserves belonging. They begin noticing certain realities and not noticing others, or noticing them but learning not to articulate them. Over time, this becomes so normal that the family's emotional logic can feel like reality itself. A child in a shame-based family may begin reading ordinary mistakes as moral failure, because the group atmosphere treats mistakes that way. A child in a volatile family may begin reading silence as danger, because the field has linked stillness with eruption. A child in an emotionally avoidant family may begin reading their own needs as excessive, because the group coherence depends on not naming them. These are not small distortions. They shape what the person perceives, expects, and feels entitled to know. The same pattern appears in friendship groups and communities, especially when belonging is closely tied to a certain tone. Some friendship groups cohere around irony, others around complaint, others around shared ambition, shared injury, shared cynicism, shared spirituality, shared moral certainty, or shared opposition to some outsider. Over time, the emotional atmosphere becomes a lens. You do not just speak within the group. You begin seeing through it. What the group laughs at matters. What it finds embarrassing matters. What it treats as sacred, ridiculous, weak, admirable, or beyond question matters. People adapt because adaptation preserves ease. Dissent requires friction. And friction is costly when belonging is carrying more than simple social contact, when it is carrying identity, safety, and self-definition. This is where identity becomes tied to group coherence. A group is not only a social location. It often becomes a mirror in which the person knows who they are. They are the kind of person who cares about this, stands against that, speaks in this language, notices these things, and dismisses those things. Identity becomes entangled with shared interpretation. And once that entanglement is strong enough, challenging the group's field no longer feels like revising an opinion. It feels like destabilizing the self. This is why some people become more certain in groups, not less. The group is reducing ambiguity. It is providing language, direction, emotional permission, and moral orientation. It says, in effect, this is how reality is to be read here. That can feel deeply relieving, especially to people who are already fragmented, exhausted, or uncertain. Ambiguity is heavy. Complexity takes energy. Belonging to a clear field relieves some of that burden. It gives the nervous system a way to settle around known positions. But the cost can be high if the price of settlement is loss of reflection. Perception changes when belonging becomes more urgent than accuracy. That sentence is the core of this section, and it needs to be understood carefully. It does not mean people consciously prefer falsehood to truth. It means that once the emotional and relational cost of seeing differently rises high enough, the system begins weighting other priorities more heavily than open-ended discernment. The person may stop asking, is this fully true? And start asking, often beneath awareness, can I afford to hold a different view here? Can I remain connected if I do? Can I remain recognizable to myself if I let the coherence of the group loosen? This is why dissent often feels so much more intense than outsiders imagine. From the outside, it may look like a simple matter of independent thinking. But from the inside, dissent can feel like risking exile, shame, fragmentation, loss of moral standing, loss of friendship, loss of identity, or at minimum, the loss of emotional ease that comes from moving with the field rather than against it. Even when the group is not explicitly coercive, the body may still be tracking enormous stakes. This is especially true in environments where belonging and morality fuse. In ideological groups, activist spaces, spiritual communities, political movements, fan cultures, institutions, and tightly bonded teams, certain views can begin carrying moral weight far beyond their informational content. To question them may not feel like intellectual nuance. It may feel like betrayal, impurity, selfishness, cowardice, or disloyalty. Once that moral charge attaches to group coherence, perception changes even more quickly. People begin seeing through the moral emotional norms of the group, because to see otherwise would risk becoming a different kind of person within the field. And that matters because the body often cannot distinguish clearly between moral dislocation and social threat. If the group treats dissent as contamination, the dissenter may experience their own questioning as dangerous, even before they have fully examined what they are questioning. The nervous system is trying to preserve connection, so it narrows, it avoids, it justifies, it adopts the dominant tone, it protects coherence. Not always because the coherence is true, but because the coherence is regulating. This is one reason why collective certainty can feel so intoxicating. It removes the strain of private ambiguity. It tells you how to feel, what to notice, what to condemn, what to defend, what to repeat, what to fear, and what to celebrate. Once the field is strong enough, all that remains is participation. The person is relieved of some of the burden of independent orientation. The crowd carries that function for them. But that relief is precisely where the danger begins. Because if the group is doing too much of the person's orienting, then the person may stop noticing how much of their perception is being socially stabilized. They may mistake emotional permission for truth. They may mistake repeated language for clarity. They may mistake collective force for moral legitimacy. And all the while, they still experience their own conviction as personal. They feel this is what I see without fully noticing that what they see has been shaped by what the group rewards, punishes, amplifies, and refuses to question. That is why it is so important to understand that belonging is not superficial. It is nervous system relevant. It shapes what feels safe to know. It shapes what feels costly to voice. It shapes how much complexity the body can tolerate before the need for coherence takes over. Once you understand that, it becomes easier to have compassion for why people remain inside certain fields, but also greater discernment about what those fields are doing to perception. And that leads directly into the next movement of the episode. Because once belonging has altered perception, emotional amplification often follows. The group not only shapes what can be seen, it begins to intensify how it is felt. Fear becomes stronger, righteousness becomes sharper, outrage becomes more contagious, certainty becomes more moral. The field permits people to feel beyond their individual baseline. That is where we move next. Part 4: Fear, Righteousness and Emotional Amplification. If belonging changes perception, then emotion often decides how powerfully that perception will be lived. Because collective states are not only held together by shared ideas, they are fueled by shared feeling. And two of the strongest fuels available are fear and righteousness. Fear narrows, righteousness hardens. When they operate together inside a group, they create one of the most potent forms of collective distortion available. A state in which people feel emotionally justified, morally clear, and psychologically compelled all at once. Reflection becomes harder. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. Complexity begins to look like weakness, betrayal, or confusion. The group starts feeling not only united, but necessary, urgent, protective, certain. This is why fear and righteousness matter so much in collective life. They do not simply color interpretation after the fact. They help produce the kind of field in which certain interpretations become emotionally inevitable. Start with shared fear. Fear in a group is not just many individuals privately anxious at the same time. Once fear becomes collective, it begins organizing attention. People scan for the same dangers. They repeat the same warnings. They notice confirming signals more readily. They become more responsive to urgency, more dependent on group consensus, and less tolerant of anyone who seems to be slowing down the emotional momentum. Under shared fear, uncertainty itself begins to feel dangerous. The group does not only want information, it wants reassurance through clarity, direction, and identification of threat. You can see this in institutional fear climates. A workplace under chronic threat, threat of layoffs, threat of public embarrassment, threat of leadership volatility, threat of failure, threat of being blamed, often becomes emotionally narrower over time. People start overreading signals. Small changes in tone feel loaded. Silence becomes suspicious. Feedback becomes threat-coded. The group starts behaving as though danger is everywhere, because enough of the emotional climate has already been organized around fear. At that point, the field does not need constant crisis to remain activated. It begins generating its own vigilance. The same dynamic appears in political escalation. When political groups become saturated with fear, the emotional logic changes. Opponents are no longer merely mistaken. They become existential threats. Compromise starts looking naive. Nuance becomes dangerous. Every event must be interpreted through the lens of encroaching catastrophe. The system is no longer asking simply, what is happening? It is asking, how close are we to collapse? That shift matters because once people feel they are standing at the edge of something irreparable, emotionally intense reactions begin to feel not only understandable but responsible. And this is where righteousness enters. Righteousness is powerful because it gives emotion moral permission. Fear alone can still feel vulnerable. It can still leave room for uncertainty, shame, or hesitation. But once fear is fused with righteousness, the group no longer feels merely threatened. It feels virtuous in its reaction. It feels not only afraid but correct to be afraid. Not only angry but morally obliged to be angry. Not only suspicious but wise to be suspicious. Righteousness converts emotion into duty. That is one reason it is so intoxicating. A group organized around righteousness often feels cleaner inside itself than it really is. Members feel bonded not only by emotion, but by the belief that the emotion itself proves integrity. We care. We see what others don't. We are the ones willing to say it. We are protecting what matters. This can happen in political spaces, activist cultures, religious settings, fandoms, institutional subcultures, and even families. Once the field becomes morally charged enough, intensity starts feeling like evidence of truth. But intensity is not truth. And this is one of the hardest recognitions for groups to tolerate. Because the emotional field often permits people to feel more intensely, and more certainly than they would alone. A person who might privately have doubts can become much more decisive in a crowd. A person who might privately feel uncomfortable with harshness can come to experience harshness as necessary once enough others are modeling it. A person who might alone notice nuance can lose access to it once the emotional baseline of the group has shifted toward moral urgency. This is not simply hypocrisy. It is amplification. Groups amplify emotion beyond individual baseline. That phrase matters because it helps explain why people sometimes feel unlike themselves inside collective states, or more precisely, why they feel like a version of themselves intensified by the field. The group gives permission. It says, you may feel this strongly here. You may speak this sharply here. You may condemn this confidently here. You may simplify this completely here. And because everyone else appears to be participating at a similar pitch, the escalation begins feeling normal. Social media outrage cycles make this visible in especially concentrated form. A story breaks, a clip circulates, a post gains traction. Within hours, sometimes minutes, a field forms. The language becomes repeated. The emotional tone becomes stabilized. Certain responses are visibly rewarded. Outrage escalates through repetition, but also through performance. People are not only reacting to the original event, they are reacting to one another reacting. The emotional field intensifies because each expression of outrage becomes additional evidence that outrage is the correct state. Once enough people join, anyone who hesitates may start feeling morally compromised, intellectually behind, or socially at risk. This is why outrage online so often outruns reflection. The environment itself rewards rapid moral positioning. Speed is treated as clarity. Certainty is treated as conscience. Hesitation becomes suspicious. The group field says, you must show that you feel the right thing and you must show it now. At that point, the individual is no longer simply processing an event. They are processing the event, the group's reaction to it, the social consequences of lagging behind the reaction, and the moral meaning attached to public alignment. Emotional amplification becomes structural. This is also why group scapegoating becomes so attractive. When a collective field is fearful, unstable, or morally inflamed, scapegoating offers relief. It narrows complexity into one emotionally usable target. It gives shape to diffuse anxiety. It transforms confusion into accusation. It allows the group to imagine that if that person, that type of person, that group, that outsider, that dissenter, that traitor, that contaminating influence were removed, the field would settle. Scapegoating is powerful because it simplifies. It says, in effect, the tension you feel has a face now, and once the face is identified, aggression becomes easier to justify. Spiritual purity cultures often operate through a similar dynamic, though with more elevated language. A group organized around purity, awakening, moral cleanliness, transcendence, or higher consciousness can become just as emotionally distorted as a political crowd, only the distortion is framed differently. Fear may attach not only to visible enemies but to impurity, lower vibration, lack of alignment, contamination by the worldly, insufficient surrender, doubt, shadow, ego, or wrong association. Righteousness then arrives as purity performance. The group no longer simply values growth. It begins performing moral or spiritual superiority through emotional tone. People become anxious about saying the wrong thing, associating with the wrong people, showing the wrong feelings, or failing to embody the right state. The field becomes fear-based while calling itself elevated. This is why purity cultures can be so emotionally constricting. They offer righteousness without obvious aggression. They let people feel morally superior while appearing serene. But underneath, the same dynamics may be operating: fear of contamination, pressure toward conformity, suppression of ambiguity, emotional amplification through group modeling, and punishment, subtle or overt, for stepping outside the accepted field. Political movements, religious communities, fan cultures, and workplaces can all produce their own versions of this. In fan communities, the beloved figure, franchise, ideology, or symbolic center becomes morally defended beyond proportion. Criticism is no longer received as simple disagreement. It becomes violation, disloyalty, ignorance, or attack. The group rallies not just around preference but around identity and emotional protection. Again, fear and righteousness work together. Fear says, what we care about is under threat. Righteousness says, and therefore our emotional intensity is justified. In institutional settings, righteousness can become procedural rather than theatrical. The group begins telling itself that its fear, control, secrecy, urgency, or rigidity are all in service of responsibility, excellence, safety, compliance, or standards. The emotional field becomes constricted, but because the constriction is framed as virtue, it is rarely questioned. People may become harsher, more suspicious, more role-bound, or more punitive, while still feeling entirely justified. That is one of the most dangerous effects of righteousness. It makes narrowing feel noble. This is why fear and righteousness are such strong fuels of collective distortion. Fear makes reflection harder because the body prioritizes survival, urgency, and threat detection. Righteousness makes reflection harder because uncertainty begins feeling morally suspect. Put them together and you get a field in which doubt feels dangerous, nuance feels disloyal, and slowing down feels irresponsible. The group becomes emotionally louder and epistemically narrower at the same time. This does not mean all shared fear is false, or all righteousness corrupt. There are real dangers in the world. There are moments when moral seriousness is appropriate. Some crises deserve coordinated response. Some injustices should provoke anger. The problem is not the existence of fear or moral feeling. The problem is what happens when those states become collectively amplified, beyond the point where reflection can remain alive. Once that threshold is crossed, people begin living inside emotionally self-confirming loops. The more afraid they become, the more evidence of danger they find. The more righteous they become, the more suspect hesitation appears. The field starts rewarding itself. It becomes harder to distinguish moral clarity from emotional momentum. And yet this is also where compassion matters. Because people do not enter these states simply because they are foolish or cruel. Often they enter because fear and righteousness offer something deeply human: coherence, direction, belonging, protection from ambiguity, permission to act, relief from fragmentation. A collective field that says, here is what matters and here is how to feel about it, can be enormously regulating to a person who is privately uncertain, isolated, or overwhelmed. The distortion is seductive precisely because it also offers comfort. That is why criticism alone is never enough. If you want to understand collective emotional amplification, you have to understand what it gives people. It gives them certainty. It gives them structure. It gives them a shared perception. It gives them language. It gives them moral elevation. It gives them numbers. It gives them relief from the burden of holding ambiguity alone. But that relief can come at the cost of reality. So the core insight of this section stands clearly. Fear and righteousness are two of the strongest fuels of collective distortion, because both make reflection harder and certainty feel morally necessary. Once you see that, the next layer becomes easier to recognize, because collective emotion does not move on its own. It is stabilized through attention, through repetition, through what everyone is made to look at, speak about, repost, react to, fear, defend, and interpret together. That is where we move next. Part 5: Collective Attention and Moral Certainty. If fear and righteousness are two of the strongest emotional fuels of collective distortion, then attention is one of the main mechanisms through which that distortion becomes organized and sustained. Because emotion alone does not create a full collective reality. It needs focus, it needs repetition, it needs a shared object. It needs something for the crowd to keep looking at together. This is why collective attention matters so much. What a group repeatedly attends to begins shaping what feels real, central, urgent, and morally significant. Attention is never just passive noticing. It is selective participation. It determines what enters the foreground of shared consciousness and what falls away into the background. So when large numbers of people are looking at the same event, enemy, threat, scandal, slogan, symbol, or emotionally loaded narrative at the same time, the field begins tightening around it. The object of attention grows psychologically larger than its objective scale alone might justify. Not necessarily because it is unreal, but because it has become prominent through repetition and coordinated focus. This is one of the most important points in the whole episode. Collective attention does not prove truth. It produces prominence, and prominence often feels like truth. That difference is easy to miss because what is repeated and highly visible often feels self-evidently central. If everyone is talking about it, reacting to it, reposting it, framing themselves around it, and emotionally saturating the field with it, then the issue begins feeling larger than life. It dominates perception. It crowds out alternatives. It becomes difficult to imagine that other realities, other interpretations, or other scales of importance still exist outside the current spotlight. The field starts saying this is what matters now, and because so many people are reinforcing that message, it becomes harder to question. This is why mass attention is reality shaping. Not because attention literally creates external reality out of nothing, but because it shapes lived reality. It determines what people experience as present, urgent, dangerous, meaningful, and morally pressing. A society, workplace, online culture, institution, fandom, or community can become so focused on one narrative that all perception begins bending toward it. Once that happens, the attention itself becomes a force. It changes what gets emotionally processed, what is socially legible, and what kinds of thoughts still have room to breathe. You can see this clearly in news cycles. A story breaks. For a period of time, it is everywhere. Every headline points toward it. Every panel discusses it. Every social platform reacts to it. Every group chat starts filling with it. The repeated visibility creates an emotional and cognitive climate in which the story no longer feels like one event among many. It becomes the event. It begins organizing mood, conversation, fear, outrage, and prediction. People wake into it, carry it through the day, and encounter it again before sleep. That degree of coordinated attention does something to consciousness. It magnifies salience. Again, salience is not the same as truth. A story may be true, partly true, distorted, selectively framed, or real, but emotionally overscaled relative to wider reality. Collective attention alone does not resolve that. What it does is make the story unavoidable. It creates prominence through repetition and emotional saturation. Once prominence reaches a certain threshold, the nervous system begins treating it as environment rather than information. The issue is no longer merely something people know about, it becomes part of the air they breathe. Trending discourse works similarly, especially online. Something starts moving through the feed. A phrase, a clip, a moral demand, a conflict, a claim, a symbolic controversy. It rises quickly because it is emotionally charged, legible and repeatable. More people join in. Soon it is everywhere. The field becomes saturated not only with the original event but with reactions to reactions to reactions. People entering the discourse no longer meet the issue neutrally. They meet an atmosphere already thick with emotional direction. At that point, they are not simply evaluating the original subject. They can start feeling socially illegible. A person may privately think there is more complexity here, or I am not sure this is proportionate, or something about the speed of this feels wrong, but collective attention has already raised the cost of holding that view. The field is emotionally concentrated. The object of attention has become sacred, dangerous, or morally untouchable. To widen the frame now risks appearing out of touch, disloyal, insensitive, morally weak, or suspect. So the individual mind begins narrowing in line with the collective focus. This is one reason prominent narratives begin to feel true through sheer coordinated attention. Again, not because attention magically creates truth, but because human beings are highly responsive to what the field treats as central. Repetition reduces friction, visibility increases familiarity, emotional saturation increases memorability. Shared focus creates the sense that something is not only important but overwhelmingly so. It trains perception. The same frame is repeated until it begins sounding natural, official, unremarkable, even inevitable. The talking point reduces interpretive complexity by offering a stable narrative structure. This is what is happening. This is what it means. This is how it is to be spoken about. Over time, people inside the field stop hearing the frame as a frame. It becomes the reality format through which the issue is encountered. Once again, prominence starts masquerading as truth. Fandom defense is another very contemporary example. When a fandom becomes large and emotionally bonded enough, its collective attention starts shaping what can and cannot be seen about the object of devotion. Criticism is no longer just disagreement. It begins threatening a shared emotional world. Fans do not simply defend because the facts are clear. They defend because the group attention around the beloved figure, story, brand, or symbolic object has made that thing morally and emotionally central. To question it is to threaten coherence. The group focus compresses alternatives. Uncomfortable evidence is minimized, reframed, or attacked, not only because people are irrational, but because the collective field has invested too much attention for complexity to remain emotionally easy. Shared narrative frames deepen all of this. A narrative frame tells people not just what to look at, but how to understand what they are seeing. It turns raw attention into moral and emotional direction, victim and aggressor, threat and protector, purity and contamination, justice and betrayal, awakening and blindness, freedom and oppression. These frames do not merely describe the object of mass attention. They structure its significance. Once enough people are focusing through the same frame, the issue becomes even more emotionally stable. Not only is everyone looking at it, they are looking at it through a common interpretive lens. That is why collective attention can feel so definitive. It is not simply the number of eyes on something. It is the number of eyes looking in the same emotional direction, through the same repeated language, with the same narrative scaffolding, under the same moral pressure. At that point, prominence becomes powerful enough to shape reality from the inside out. People begin feeling that everyone knows what this means, what must be said, who is right, who is dangerous, and what reaction counts as morally legitimate. But that feeling can be deeply misleading, because attention always excludes as well as includes. To spotlight one issue is also to push others into the dark. To emotionally saturate one narrative is to reduce the mental space available for competing interpretations. To focus a crowd intensely is to simplify the world for the duration of that focus. That simplification can be useful in moments of genuine collective action or crisis, but it can also become a trap. A group so focused on one emotionally charged object may lose access to context, proportion, contradiction, or the quieter truths not currently under the spotlight. So the mature task is not to pretend collective attention does not matter. It matters enormously, nor is it to become falsely detached and act as though repeated concern is always hysteria. The task is to recognize what coordinated attention does to consciousness. It enlarges, it saturates, it narrows, it legitimizes, it repeats until prominence starts feeling like proof. And that is why the core insight of this section matters so much. Collective attention does not prove truth. It produces prominence, and prominence often feels like truth. Once that is understood, the next question becomes even more revealing. If coordinated attention can create this much emotional certainty, then what happens when those processes are intensified by algorithms, online swarms, institutional reinforcement, fandom identity and communities built around certainty itself? Why do people sometimes feel safer inside shared distortion than alone with unresolved reality? That is where we move next. Part 6: Online swarms, institutions, fandoms, and the comfort of shared distortion. If collective attention produces prominence, and prominence begins feeling like truth, then the next thing we have to examine is where this becomes especially visible in modern life. And one of the clearest places is wherever groups become emotionally self-reinforcing. Online swarms, institutions, fandoms, workplace ideological climates, digital communities built around certainty, spaces where people do not simply share an interest or concern, but begin reflecting, amplifying, and stabilizing one another's emotional reality until the shared field feels more solid than private doubt ever could. This is where collective distortion becomes not only powerful but comforting, because people do not only join groups for truth, they often join them for coherence, relief, validation, and identity stabilization. That point matters, because too much criticism of crowd behavior is shallow. It mocks people for being influenced without understanding what the group is providing psychologically. And if you do not understand what the group is providing, you will not understand why people stay, why they intensify, why they defend, and why leaving can feel so destabilizing. Shared distortion often does something very relieving to the nervous system. It reduces inner conflict. It gives language. It gives belonging. It turns uncertainty into shared certainty. It makes people feel protected by numbers. It says, in effect, you do not have to hold ambiguity alone here. We are all feeling this together. We are all seeing this together. We are all right together. That is a powerful offer. Start with online pylons. An online pylon often begins with a triggering object, a statement, a clip, a post, a mistake, a symbol, a person who can be rapidly made to represent something larger. The first wave of reaction arrives, then the second, then the third. Before long, it is no longer a single reaction to a single event. It is a collective emotional field. Thousands of people may now be participating in outrage, disgust, accusation, defense, or contempt, while also seeing visible proof that many others are doing the same. This is key. The pylon does not only intensify because people feel something strongly, it intensifies because they see that others feel it strongly too. At that point, the group provides emotional permission. It says, your outrage is not excessive because look how many others share it. Your certainty is not rash because the field already feels aligned. Your aggression feels less like aggression because it has been absorbed into collective moral tone. And once the numbers are visible, the person no longer experiences themselves as a lone reactor. They experience themselves as part of a justified force. This is why online swarms can feel so morally clean from the inside, even when they are psychologically chaotic from the outside. They create a kind of emotional legitimization through volume. If enough people are saying it, posting it, condemning it, repeating it, mocking it, or defending it, the sheer scale starts becoming evidence. Not logical evidence, but emotional evidence. It feels impossible that so many people could be caught up in the same thing unless the thing itself was self-evidently true, urgent, or morally clear. But what is often being measured there is not truth. It is coordinated activation. And this is where algorithmic group reinforcement becomes especially important. Digital environments do not merely host human reaction. They shape its visibility, repetition, and speed. The algorithm learns what generates engagement, and engagement is often strongest where emotion is strongest. Outrage, fear, conflict, scandal, moral sharpness, certainty, symbolic conflict, all of these travel well. They do not just move because humans are flawed. They move because the system rewards what keeps people looking, reacting, and returning. So the person online is not just encountering random public opinion. They are encountering a technologically amplified emotional field. That means distortion can become structurally reinforced. If you are already uncertain, activated, or emotionally primed, and the system repeatedly shows you content that confirms the dominant mood of your subgroup, then inner doubt starts losing ground. The field keeps saying the same thing in slightly different ways. The emotional climate becomes harder to escape. It starts feeling like reality because it is now what surrounds you most often. Not all because it is true. Not all because everyone thinks it. But because the architecture of visibility is making certain emotional realities more prominent than others. This is also why digital communities built around certainty feel so strong. They do not only provide information, they provide a stable atmosphere. They tell members what to notice, how to react, what language belongs, what kinds of suspicion are wise, what kinds of softness are weak, what kinds of nuance are dangerous, and what kind of emotional stance marks you as one of us. The person entering such a community often experiences relief before they experience distortion. Relief that someone is finally naming what they feel. Relief that other people seem to get it. Relief that confusion has been reduced to a clean field of meaning. This is what makes shared distortion so seductive. It soothes before it traps. And that same structure appears in fandom identity. From the outside, fandom can look harmless, playful, or trivial. Sometimes it is. But when identity becomes tightly fused to the object devotion, a public figure, a franchise, a worldview, a scene, a community, a symbolic center, criticism of that object starts feeling much larger than simple disagreement. It begins threatening coherence. The fandom is no longer merely about enjoyment. It is about belonging, emotional investment, memory, identity, status, and often self-location. The fan does not only love the object, they have built part of themselves in relation to it. So when criticism appears, the group often mobilizes not merely to evaluate whether the criticism is fair, but to defend the emotional structure holding the community together. Again, the distortion is comforting because it protects identity. The group offers a place where the object remains morally or emotionally safe, where doubt is held at bay, where complexity is minimized, and where loyalty is rewarded. The result is not just defense of the object, but defense of the self through the object. Institutions do similar things in more respectable language. Institutional groupthink often does not feel like hysteria. It feels procedural, professional, sensible, necessary. But the underlying dynamics can be very similar. A workplace, university, bureaucracy, or organization may develop a climate in which certain interpretations are safe, others are difficult, and some are barely thinkable. Official language stabilizes the preferred frame. Reputational cues reinforce it. Informal social dynamics reward alignment. Those who question too much may not be openly exiled, but they may become harder to place, trust, or absorb. The result is a field in which people begin experiencing the dominant interpretation not only as policy, but as emotional and social common sense. This is where workplace ideological climates become particularly revealing. A workplace may become organized around one emotional tone: fear, compliance, ambition, moral signaling, innovation, disruption, inclusion, risk aversion, or institutional loyalty, and over time, employees begin shaping themselves accordingly. Speech changes. Doubt gets filtered. Certain concerns become easy to voice because they fit the field, and others begin feeling dangerous, exhausting, or socially expensive. In these environments, people often stop noticing how much adaptation they are doing, because adaptation itself becomes the emotional baseline. And here again, the comfort is central. It is easier to function inside a climate whose rules are known, even if the climate is narrow, than to remain internally split and uncertain. People may privately feel doubt, contradiction, or fatigue, but shared distortion gives them a way to flatten the discomfort. It says, here is the approved language, here is the acceptable concern, here is the moral posture, here is the approved suspicion, here is the right level of alarm, here is the right level of loyalty. Once the person adopts the field, inner tension often reduces, not because reality has become clearer, but because the group now carries the burden of orientation. That reduction of inner conflict is one of the deepest comforts groups provide. A person may be carrying uncertainty, shame, confusion, fear, social dislocation, or fragmented selfhood. Then they enter a group that gives them a stable frame. Suddenly they no longer have to metabolize everything alone. Their emotional life becomes mirrored, named, and supported by many others. The group says, your feeling is valid, your reaction is right, your enemy is real, your suspicion is shared, your certainty belongs here. Is it helping people feel protected by scale, by repetition, by alignment, by emotional mirroring? Because if it is doing those things, then its hold will be strong, even if it is distorting reality in the process. And that leads to a crucial insight for this whole episode. People do not only join groups for truth. They often join them for coherence, relief, validation, and identity stabilization. That is not a cynical statement. It is a humane one. It recognizes that collective distortion is often compelling precisely because it meets human needs. The problem is not that it meets those needs. The problem is what happens when the price of that relief is loss of reflection. And that takes us to the next part. Because if groups offer that much comfort, then we need to understand more deeply why the crowd can feel so soothing in the first place. Why collective energy can reduce existential ambiguity. Why being part of something larger can feel like clarity, even when what is being clarified is only the emotional logic of the field. That is where we move next. Part 7. The psychological comfort of the crowd. To understand collective conscious states properly, you have to understand not only how groups distort, but why they soothe. If you miss that, your analysis becomes shallow. You end up criticizing crowds from a distance without understanding what they are doing for the people inside them. And the truth is, crowds often provide something deeply human. They provide relief. Relief from ambiguity, relief from fragmentation, relief from standing alone inside uncertainty, and relief from having to generate meaning entirely by yourself. This is why the crowd can feel so powerful, because the crowd does not only amplify emotion, it also organizes it. It takes what may have felt scattered, private, confusing, or difficult to articulate, and gives it rhythm, direction, and shared confirmation. A person enters feeling uncertain, and the crowd offers certainty. A person enters feeling diffuse, and the crowd offers shape. A person enters feeling isolated, and the crowd offers belonging. A person enters carrying private tension, and suddenly that tension is mirrored by hundreds or thousands of others. The feeling is no longer lonely, it becomes collective, and that can be profoundly regulating in the moment. This is why crowds soothe ambiguity. Ambiguity is difficult for the nervous system, especially when a person is already under stress, disoriented, emotionally flooded, or existentially uncertain. To not know what is happening, what to believe, who is right, what matters, what side to be on, or what kind of person one is becoming, can be psychologically exhausting. Ambiguity requires tolerance. It requires inner capacity. It asks a person to remain open without collapsing too quickly into certainty. That is hard work. The crowd removes some of that burden. It says, here is the frame, here is the emotion, here is the response, here is the tone, here is what matters, here is what must be defended, here is what must be feared, here is what kind of self belongs here. That clarity can feel like truth, but often what it first provides is relief. Relief from the strain of having to hold unresolved reality alone. This is one reason why group energy can feel like clarity even when it is not especially reflective. The body often experiences collective emotional alignment as coherence. When many people are oriented in the same direction, using the same language, sharing the same emotional tone, and reacting to the same symbols or threats, the field begins to feel stable. A person inside that field may experience this stability as insight. They may think, now I finally see. But sometimes what they are really experiencing is the nervous system comfort of synchronization. Synchronization can feel like revelation because it reduces inner conflict. A person who was previously torn, doubtful, fragmented, ashamed, uncertain, or emotionally split may suddenly feel gathered by the group. Their internal contradictions quiet down because the field is now doing part of the organizing for them. Their feelings are echoed, their language is supplied, their emotional tone is mirrored, their interpretation is socially reinforced. This creates a powerful impression of certainty, not because the complexity has actually disappeared, but because the group has absorbed some of the tension that uncertainty would otherwise require the individual to carry. That is why being part of something larger can relieve fragmentation. Human beings often feel more coherent when they are held in a field of shared purpose, shared narrative, or shared emotional direction. This is not always pathological. In many cases, it is deeply human and even beautiful. Shared ritual can regulate, collective grief can heal. A protest can give moral courage, a spiritual community can provide meaning, a movement can help people feel less alone in what they care about, a team can give direction, a family can offer orientation, a choir, a crowd, a ceremony, a group prayer, a march, a football ground, a classroom, a shared silence. All of these can generate forms of collective participation that soothe and strengthen. So the point here is not to sneer at groups. Group participation is human. Collective states can provide meaning and solidarity. They can reduce isolation. They can help people act together. They can generate courage that the individual might not access alone. They can support healing, belonging, mutual recognition, and common purpose. The issue is not belonging itself. The issue is unconscious belonging. The issue is what happens when the relief provided by the crowd becomes more important than reflection inside it. When the person no longer knows whether they are in contact with reality, or simply in contact with a field so emotionally persuasive that it feels like reality. When synchronization becomes fusion, when solidarity becomes suppression of doubt, when meaning becomes identity capture, when belonging begins replacing discernment. This is where the crowd becomes psychologically dangerous. Not because crowds are inherently evil, but because collective force is easily confused with moral legitimacy. If enough people feel something intensely enough, it can begin to seem self-validating. A person looks around and sees emotional certainty everywhere. The room is convinced. The feed is convinced. The movement is convinced. The institution is speaking in one voice. The crowd is chanting. The language is repeated. The energy is rising. At that point, the sheer force of the collective state can feel like proof. But force is not proof. Scale is not proof. Intensity is not proof. And shared conviction is not proof. Yet we repeatedly confuse collective force with moral legitimacy because collective force feels so stabilizing. It feels like the burden of moral ambiguity has been lifted. If everyone here sees this clearly, then perhaps I do not need to keep wrestling with doubt. If the crowd is this emotionally sure, then maybe hesitation is weakness. If the field is moving this strongly, then maybe slowing down is betrayal. That is where collective comfort begins turning into collective danger. Because the same field that reduces existential anxiety can also reduce self-questioning. The same shared certainty that relieves fragmentation can also make it harder to tolerate complexity. The same belonging that soothes disconnection can also become the thing a person protects at the expense of truth. Once the crowd is doing too much of the person's orienting, the person becomes less able to ask, what do I actually see? They become more likely to ask, what must I feel to remain coherent here? This is why the crowd can feel like a refuge during periods of disorientation. A person struggling privately may enter a group and feel held for the first time in months or years. The group gives them language for their pain. It explains their confusion. It tells them who the enemy is, where the problem lies, what side they are on, and what kind of response is expected. This can feel like salvation. And in one sense, something important may genuinely be happening. They are no longer alone. But loneliness relieved through total group identification can become its own trap if the person loses access to private discernment in the process. What makes this difficult is that the comfort is real. That must be emphasized. The comfort is not fake just because the field may also distort. The meaning is not unreal just because the group may be overcertain. The solidarity is not worthless just because it may compress complexity. Human beings often join collective fields for reasons that deserve compassion. They are tired, frightened, excluded, uncertain, fragmented, hungry for recognition, morally alarmed, or desperate for language that makes experience legible. The crowd answers those needs quickly. It says, you are not alone. You are not mad. We feel it too. We see it too. You belong here. That answer is powerful precisely because it is partly true. But it becomes dangerous when the need for that answer silences all further questioning. When people are no longer allowed to notice that the group may be rewarding rage more than thought, certainty more than truth, performance more than contact, enemies more than complexity, slogans more than understanding. At that point, the crowd is no longer simply providing belonging. It is providing relief at the cost of reflection. And that is the core insight of this whole section. The crowd becomes dangerous when it offers psychological relief at the cost of reflection. That sentence does not condemn collective life. It clarifies its risk. The problem is not that people need one another. The problem is not that they feel stronger, calmer, or more coherent in groups. The problem is not that shared feeling exists. The problem is what happens when the field becomes so soothing, so morally convincing, and so identity stabilizing that the person stops noticing how much of their certainty is being carried by the crowd. That is why conscious life does not require rejecting all collectives. It requires learning how to remain human inside them, how to belong without dissolving, how to feel solidarity without surrendering perception, how to participate without becoming fully absorbed by the field. That does not mean every activation is bad, but it does mean that your body is part of the evidence. Then comes a second question: is certainty rising faster than reflection? That is one of the clearest warning signs available. If you notice yourself becoming more convinced, more intense, more aligned, more outraged, or more morally clear without a matching increase in depth, complexity, or calm discernment, the field may be doing more of the thinking than you realize. Groups often reward certainty because certainty stabilizes belonging. But consciousness requires more than confidence. It requires room to reflect. It also helps to ask, what language is being repeated here? Every strong collective field has repeated language, phrases, slogans, moral cues, emotionally loaded shorthand, repeated enemies, repeated values, repeated threats. Repetition is not automatically wrong, but it is always revealing. It tells you what the field wants to keep alive. It tells you what emotional direction is being reinforced. If you can hear the repeated language, you can often hear the emotional architecture beneath it. Alongside that, notice which emotions the field rewards. Is fear rewarded? Outrage? Moral superiority? Urgency? Sentimentality? Suspicion? Purity? Certainty? Belonging through contempt? Some groups reward grief honestly. Others reward only anger. Some reward loyalty over truth. Others reward performance over contact. Once you see what the field rewards, you begin seeing what it is producing. And just as importantly, what cannot be questioned here. That question often reveals more than what is openly stated. What topics, phrases, symbols, or assumptions create immediate tension if touched? What forms of nuance are treated as betrayal? What doubts feel socially expensive? The point is not to become oppositional for its own sake. It is to notice where the group stops being a place of shared inquiry and starts becoming a place of enforced coherence. This is where the distinction between solidarity and fusion matters. Solidarity allows relationship, purpose, and shared action without requiring the death of inner reference. Fusion is different. Fusion asks you to disappear into the emotional field, to confuse the group's certainty with your own seeing, to let belonging replace perception. Remaining human means staying relational without surrendering internal contact. So the practical questions become, what happens to me in this group? Do I become clearer or more performative? More reflective or more certain? More human or more role-bound? What part of me feels safer because the group is thinking for me? Those questions are not antisocial. They are protective. They help you remain in contact with your own awareness while still participating in collective life. And that is the real aim, not isolation, but conscious participation. Part 9: Integration. Staying conscious inside the crowd. By this point in the episode, the goal should be much clearer. The aim is not to become permanently detached from groups. It is not to become suspicious of every community, too proud to belong, or so afraid of influence that you retreat into private isolation and call that freedom. Human beings are not built for that. They need relationship, shared meaning, co-regulation, solidarity, and at times the strength of collective life. The issue is not participation itself. The issue is whether participation remains conscious. So the goal is not detachment. The goal is literacy within collective energy. That means learning to stay aware of what happens to consciousness inside the crowd. It means noticing when a group is widening your humanity and when it is quietly reducing it. It means recognizing when collective life is giving you support, courage, and clarity, and when it is offering something more dangerous, borrowed certainty, moral permission without reflection, and relief from ambiguity at the cost of self-contact. To stay conscious in the crowd means noticing emotional amplification. That is one of the first practical signs. When you are in a group, what happens to your emotional intensity? Do you become more certain, more outraged, more afraid, more devotional, more suspicious, more performative, more eager to align, more quick to condemn? Does the field increase your feeling without increasing your depth? That matters. Emotional amplification is not always bad. A group can deepen grief, courage, solidarity, and even love in ways that are profoundly human. But once emotion begins rising faster than reflection, you need to pay attention. The field may be carrying you further than your own awareness has yet examined. To stay conscious in the crowd also means refusing borrowed certainty. Borrowed certainty is one of the most seductive things a collective field can offer. It feels good. It feels like relief. It feels like finally knowing what matters, who is right, who is wrong, what side you are on, and what kind of person you must be to remain coherent inside the group. But certainty that arrives mainly because the field is emotionally aligned is not the same as clarity that survives reflection. Borrowed certainty says, this feels obvious because everyone here feels it together. Conscious participation asks, would this still feel as obvious if I step back from the group atmosphere for a while? That is not betrayal, that is stewardship of awareness. Protecting reflection becomes essential here. Reflection is what collective intensity often compresses first. Once the atmosphere becomes strong enough, people stop asking deeper questions because the emotional and moral cues of the field already seem sufficient. Reflection slows. Certainty accelerates. Identity fuses. The crowd begins feeling like a complete reality rather than one field among many. To stay conscious means guarding the reflective space where complexity can still exist. It means keeping open the part of you that can still ask, what is happening here? What is this group amplifying? What is being repeated? What has become unsayable? What emotional state am I inside? What feels true only because it is socially reinforced. To protect reflection, you often have to stay in contact with the body. This matters because the body registers group shifts before ideology explains them. It notices when your breath has shortened, when your tone has changed, when your body has become more rigid, when your speech has become more performative, when your attention has become narrower, when your emotional certainty is climbing faster than your actual understanding. The body is one of the few places where you may still be able to catch yourself before the field fully absorbs you. If you lose contact with the body, it becomes much easier to mistake emotional momentum for truth. This is why staying conscious in the crowd often looks very simple from the outside. Slowing your breath, widening your eyes, letting your body register what is happening instead of getting swept along at the pace of the group. Noticing whether your speech has changed. Noticing whether you are reacting because you see more clearly, or because the field has made one kind of feeling feel morally required. The body is not a perfect oracle, but it is often the first place where collective pressure becomes visible. Questioning when belonging begins replacing truth is another crucial practice. Belonging matters. It matters profoundly. But when belonging becomes more urgent than truth, perception starts bending around the need to remain included. The person stops asking, "What do I actually think?" and starts asking more subtly, "What keeps me coherent here?" Once that shift occurs, the group is no longer simply supporting identity, it is managing perception. Staying conscious means catching that moment, the moment when you feel that to question something would threaten your place in the field, the moment when silence feels safer than honesty, the moment when alignment feels more regulating than truth. That does not mean you must always oppose the group. Often the group may be right about much of what it sees. The point is not reflexive dissent. The point is to remain relational without becoming fused, to belong without dissolving, to participate without surrendering the capacity to step back internally and ask what the field is doing to your awareness. And that is what it means to remain human when the field wants performance. Many collective environments do not simply want participation. They want a version of you, the morally aligned version, the emotionally predictable version, the role-bound version, the one who knows what to say, when to say it, how to feel, whom to condemn, whom to defend, what to amplify, and what to suppress. Remaining human means resisting the reduction of self into role. It means staying in contact with the slower, more honest, less crowd-trained parts of yourself. The parts that can still feel grief without spectacle, conviction without cruelty, doubt without collapse, and solidarity without surrendering discernment. So the closing questions of this part are not rhetorical. They are diagnostic. Where do you disappear into group energy? What collectives make you less reflective? What communities widen you rather than absorb you? How do you stay yourself without isolating? Those questions matter because conscious life is not lived outside all fields. It is lived within them, among them, and often under their pressure. The task is not escape. The task is remembering. This episode has explored something both ancient and immediate, the fact that consciousness does not stop at the individual mind. People do not only think and feel as private selves, they also participate in group states that shape perception, amplify certainty, organize emotion, and make some realities easier to inhabit than others. Groups generate climates. Crowds can soothe ambiguity. Belonging can alter what becomes thinkable. Shared attention can make prominence feel like truth. Fear and righteousness can make certainty feel morally necessary. Online swarms, institutions, fandoms, and collective movements can all provide relief, language, coherence, and identity, while also narrowing reflection if the field becomes too total. But the answer is not cynicism. The answer is not permanent distance from all communities, all solidarities, all shared projects, all movements of collective life. The answer is awareness. To recognize that group participation is human, that collective states can provide meaning and solidarity, and that the real danger is not belonging itself, but unconscious belonging. The crowd becomes dangerous when it offers psychological relief at the cost of reflection. So the work is not to stand outside human life, it is to remain conscious inside it. Once you see how body, language, relationship, and group energy shape consciousness, the next question is no longer only what influences us. It becomes how we begin reclaiming awareness from autopilot, from drift, and from the pressures that think through us. That is where we move in the next episode. In episode 19, Reclaiming Yourself from Autopilot, we'll turn from collective shaping toward personal interruption. We'll explore what it means to catch loops in real time, to notice when automatic living begins taking over, and to recover awareness before the pattern fully hardens. Until then, I leave you with this. Pay attention to the groups you enter, the atmospheres you adopt, the certainties that arrive too quickly, and the places where belonging begins asking you to disappear. Until next time, you've been listening to the Consciousness Code podcast, episode 18, Collective Conscious States. I'm James Miller.